So I also want to give you some stuff to chew on to really make this challenge feel real. I want to provide some extra context for two topics we have talked about regularly. The first is our conversations, my series, or our series, where we have shared quotes and stories from Americans who were born into slavery. For those who don't know, I've been doing this for about 2 years, on and off. It's, I think, a really important project that brings a lot of voices back into our conversations about history that have traditionally been left out and haven't been heard. And I've shared a lot of important things about how I feel about those statements. Specifically, after the first few weeks, I had to start looking deeper. And one thing I found very quickly was the Slave Narrative Project. That's where I've gotten a lot of these stories from. And I've talked about my complicated feelings about it. Rick has talked about some of the criticisms that have been levied at it. But today, I want to share some of that information all together, all at once, to give you something to think about as you see me share these stories in the future, or even if you go back and see the ones I've shared in the past. So first thing I want to do is I want to share the introduction to the Slave Narrative Project. You've heard a lot of these stories, but I don't know if I've ever read the full introduction to the project as a whole and what it meant to the people who made it. In the Depression years between 1936 and 1938, the WPA Federal Writers Project, the FWP, sent out-of-work writers in 17 states to interview ordinary people. So already we could see this happened during the Depression, and that's part of why it happened. There's so much context in these simple statements. Initially, only 4 states involved in the project, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, focused on collecting the stories of people who had once been held in slavery. John A. Lomax, the National Advisor on Folklore and Folkways for the FWP, and the curator of the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress, was extremely interested in the ex-slave material he received from these states. In 1937, he directed the remaining states involved in the project to carry out interviews with former slaves as well. Federal field workers were given instructions on what kind of questions to ask their informants and how to capture their dialects, the result of which may sometimes be offensive to today's readers. The field workers often visited the people they interviewed twice in order to gather as many recollections as possible. Sometimes they took photographs of their informants and their houses. The interviews then turned their narratives over to the state's FWP director for editing and eventual transfer to Washington, D.C. The administrative files accompanying the narratives detail information supplied to our field workers, as well as the subject of concern to state directors of FWP. In 1939, FWP lost its funding, and the states were ordered to send whatever manuscripts they had and collected to Washington. Once most of the materials had arrived at the Library of Congress, Benjamin A. Botkin, the folklore editor of the FWP, who later became the head of the Archive of Folk Culture at the Library of Congress, undertook the remaining editing and indexing of the narratives and selected photographs. As noted above, he organized the narratives by state and then alphabetically. I next want to read a quick comment from a note right below that section titled, "A Note on the Language of Narratives." This letter is reproduced in George P. Pollock, From Sundown to Sunup, The Making of the Black Community, from Connecticut Greenwood Press, 1972. The slave narrative collection in the manuscript division at the Library of Congress consists of narrative texts derived from oral interviews. The narratives usually involve some attempt by the interviewers to reproduce in writing the spoken language of the people they interviewed, in accordance with instructions from the project's headquarters, the National Office of the Federal Writers Project in Washington, D.C. The interviewers were writers, not professionals trained in the phonetic transcription of speech. And the instructions they received were not altogether clear. Quote unquote, I recommend that truth to idiom be paramount and exact truth to pronunciation secondary, wrote the project's editor, John Lomax, in one letter to his interviewers in 16 states. Yet he also urged that, quote unquote, words that definitely have a notably different pronunciation from usual should be recorded as heard, evidently assuming that, quote unquote, the usual was self-evident. In fact, the situation was far more problematic than the instructions from the project leaders recognized. All the informants were, of course, black. Most interviewers were white. And by the 1930s, when the interviews took place, white representations of black speech had already had an ugly history of entrenched stereotype dating back at least to the early 19th century. What most interviewers assumed to be the usual patterns of their informant speech was unavoidably influenced by preconceptions and stereotypes. The result, as historian Lawrence W. Levine has written, is, quote unquote, a melange of accuracy and fantasy, of sensitivity and stereotype, of empathy and racism, that may sometimes be offensive to today's readers. Yet whatever else they may be, the representations of speech in the narratives are a pervasive and powerful reminder that these documents are not only a record of a time that was already history when they were created, they are themselves irreducibly historical, the products of a particular time and particular places in the long and troubled mediation of African American culture by other Americans. So with all that being said, what do we do with this information? How do we approach things like the slave narratives, knowing all this and knowing we have to reckon with it? Well, the last thing I'd like to read as part of the Slave Narrative Project today is an answer to that very question, under the title, The Limitations of the Slave Narrative Collection. The limitations of the slave narrative collection. Problems of memory. Before the resurgence of interest in slavery generated by the black protest movement of the 1960s and 1970s, few historians or social scientists sought to mine the riches of ex-slave testimonies. One major reason for this neglect was until 1972, the entire collection was relatively inaccessible. Although the original transcripts were available for reference in the rare book division of the Library of Congress, the collection does not circulate, and its sheer bulk, more than 10,000 unindexed pages, undoubtedly discouraged efforts to use it more widely and effectively. Since the early 1970s, however, both the entire slave narrative collection and selections from it have been widely reprinted, and the present effort by the Library of Congress to make the collection available through the internet now renders that limitation moot. A more significant reason for the neglect of the slave narrative collection before the 1970s, however, was the circumspection with which historians have generally regarded personal reminiscences. Recollection of the past is always highly subjective. One continually susceptible to modification and distortion. The alleged untrustworthiness of these interviews with aged former slaves has, therefore, been a frequent and not inconsequential objection to their use in historical research. For example, John Blasingame, whose book, The Slave Communities, was a pioneering effort to analyze the personal accounts of former slaves, in this case primarily the antebellum slave narratives, has been especially skeptical of the slave narrative collection interviews, and, although aware of their existence, did not use them in the slave community for fear that their use would, quote unquote, lead almost inevitably to a simplistic and distorted view of the plantation as a paternalistic institution where the chief feature of life was mutual love and respect between masters and slaves. And while that is not the entire narrative, that is something I have come into contact with multiple times reading these. I've also seen multiple people talk about how they really want the interviewer to be gentle with them because they don't know if they're remembering this correctly. They're aware that their memories are fading. All these problems are front and center the second you try to engage with these topics. Returning to the writing, certainly the interviews in the slave narrative collection present problems beyond the general issue of reliability and accuracy. Not only had more than 70 years elapsed between emancipation and the time of the interview, but most informants had experienced slavery only as children or adolescents. These factors often combined to make them look upon the past through rose-colored glasses. They fondly defined events and situations that had not been, in reality, so positive as they recalled them. There it is. So, with all that being said, how do we use these sources? Their answer is, at best, with the awareness that the totalizing of history cannot be reconstructed from these interested, selective, and fragmentary accounts, and with an acknowledgement of the interventionist role of the interpreter, the equally interested labor of historical revision, and the impossibility of reconstituting the past free from the disfigurements of present concerns. With all these provisions issued, the narratives remain nonetheless an important source of understanding the everyday experience of slavery and its aftermath. I read these documents with the hope of gaining a glimpse of black life during slavery and the postbellum period, while remaining aware of the impossibility of reconstituting the experience of the enslaved. And I think all that really speaks to how complicated this process is. How learning from the past is so often more complicated than hearing about it. It's hearing about it and then learning more to reflect on, and then reflecting on that, and then learning more about reflecting on that.